Hi, this is John with Wisdom for the Church. Thank you for tuning into the channel. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. And as always, thank you for watching. All right, welcome back to Wisdom for the Church. I am joined, as our theme has been recently, it seems like, again, by a returning guest, and that is Jeff Wright. He is a pastor, an overall family man. He's a teacher, and I think his Twitter says he's a free Narnian. So I'm so happy to have you again, man. How you doing?
John, I'm doing really well, and it's an honor to be back on, man. I really enjoyed the last time. Appreciate what you're doing, and just really thankful to get a chance to come back and talk to you.
Yeah. So I have wondered on that, the free Narnian. Obviously, it's a reference to the Chronicles of Narnia. Is that a statement on your kind of spiritual state, free, or is it something more shallow than that?
Well, it's spiritual, and then also sort of, I guess, civic as well. The phrase, when I use it, I think of the last battle, where Narnia is being run by people who hate Narnia and are corrupting it and betraying it. And the Free Narnia movement there in the last battle, I think, is really relevant. I mean, C.S. Lewis is, the lady who wrote Peer Nisi, Susanna something, I think, said that C.S. Lewis organized her mind. And I feel like, for whatever degree I have an organized mind, Lewis did that for me too. But his fiction is it's just a fountain of good metaphors. And this one is pretty relevant, I think.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I've always found that interesting. And I thought, you have to put something on that little account. And so that's like one of the few phrases that you use. And so I'm glad you got to explain that a little bit. I think Trump might have said that under his breath when he finally put his fist in the air. I think he said for Narnia.
Okay, I'm going to believe that.
Yeah.
That's going to be headcanon.
I saw it under his lips as the eagle flew behind him next to the flag. People miss some of those intricate details. I saw those. What an incredible scene that was.
And the media's trying to hide it from us, right? The media doesn't want that out.
They had an eagle with a do-rag, an American do-rag. I mean, some shades on. They're trying to hide all the cool stuff from us. What are they doing? Yeah. Well, that intros us a little bit. For those that watch this, we are talking about essentially, where do we go from here? We've had a lot happen in the last month, 2 months in our nation politically. Some things that you could only dream would happen have happened. A crazy moment in the presidential debate, a crazy moment with Donald Trump's assassination attempt, a crazy moment with Biden dropping out, and we're still 4 months away from a national election. And so the drama will probably keep going on.
Sure.
But I have, to start us out, kind of a soliloquy, if you will, and thought I'd get your thoughts on it, kind of start us. So, all right, where we have been, I think, in our nation, if we think the last 50, 60 years. For years and years, we were towns and communities, and our towns and communities seemingly were more intact than they are today. Not perfect, still infiltrated with sin, but more intact. Our families in general were more intact. Our churches overall were more intact and connected. Our neighborhoods where we lived were more connected. We were kind of localists.
Mm-hmm.
Seemingly now, not only are we globalists, but we're also, I think, I've fallen into this before for sure, we're sort of silos now. We're all just our own individual person. I go to my job, I get my paycheck, I bring it back, and it's kind of rinse and repeat. I've seen this trend, weirdly enough, even in like sports. I'm a sports fan, basketball, football, my main two. So even in sports, it felt like to me, like probably 30, 40 years ago, there was a more team atmosphere that naturally developed, and there was more honor in it, even though I'm sure it wasn't perfect. But now it's just, you've heard the phrase, get the bag. Get the bag. Get the bag, get mine, get on, and get out.
Player empowerment.
Player empowerment. Yeah, and it's the same thing, and I think even in the economy, where it's like all of us seem to fall into this. We're all just kind of mercenaries for hire until the next thing. We're not sort of taking ownership in this, invested in this. So we've become silos. We've also somehow become globalists. If you zoom out on the Google Earth image and you think of nationally and politically, it seems like those who are national politicians don't respect natural categories that God has set in place either. The nation state, the image of God, the importance of family, what a family actually is, the importance of local cultures. And so we're in this big mess. And so I wanted to start there. That's what I think that I've seen in my lifetime, especially more lately. But talking about the more localism thing and that being lost, have you sensed that? Have you experienced that kind of growing up in your life now? And what might be some examples of that? We'll start there.
Yeah, man. I mean, that you've described my experience too. So I'm in my 40s now. I've got some miles on the odometer.
Right.
Um, the road I live on, I knew every family, and they knew my family going back countless generations. That's not the case as much anymore, although thankfully I'm insulated from some of those forces. But I think particularly with my father's generation. So I was a late in life child for my father, so he's pushing 80 now.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but my dad's world was defined by relationships that were within driving distance.
Yep.
And most of those relationships, and I honestly can say the core relationships were basically within walking distance. Um, and I got to experience some of that growing up in a small town, and some of that's still here. But um, I think it's been lost in a couple different ways. I think that our sense of the good life was, if you can kind of borrow Aaron Renn's categories of positive world, neutral world, and negative world. Sometime in neutral world in my lifespan, the idea of the good life stopped being deeply enmeshed with these people that I live in close proximity to somewhere out there, often a major city.
Yep.
Um, but the good life became sort of synonymous, and I guess I'm talking about my peers, with like, how great is your Instagram? Can you can you show all the great meals you're having at these wonderful restaurants? Can you show that, you're in, I don't know, where people travel to, Tahiti and Rome and
Yep.
Greece, and that was the good life. And what you just described is the core of that. It's this individual free from any external attachments, moving from sensory experience to sensory experience. And of course, that can be sexual. I mean, hookup
Yeah.
culture, Tinder, all those things rose in that time. But
Yeah.
even for people who didn't turn themselves over to debauchery, um, there was a version of that was
Yeah.
just a good life is defined by what your passport, how many passport stamps you have.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's been a net positive for humans in the West.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you say some things there that I definitely feel like I have sensed, and I've even, I'm sure, fallen into, like, in my
Sure.
life. Like, we're going to use the term that you've brought out here, the good life, or kind of the ideal. Maybe we might even say the American dream.
Yeah.
It has become far less, you know, investing in this place and seeing that there's something natural about investing here. Not that moving's wrong or evil or anything, but there's something natural about this. Where does that come from? And it seems like it became, yeah, basically some sort of escape, or ascending higher than this was like, I'm going to make it out of this town. That kind of
Yeah.
thing. Like that line, I've heard it. I feel like in every movie I've ever grown up with, that was like the main character's goal was to finally make it out of this town.
Hmm.
And like you said, it happens in different ways. It happens in escapism, in sexual deviancy. Could be, I feel like financial freedom, while that's a
Hmm.
good thing, is a massive idol in this whole conversation. Like every other ad I see on YouTube or something is like, finally you can be free. Finally, if you just follow these 10 steps, it's always some guy like on a beautiful island or something. And it's basically like, that's like the greatest ideal, is when you can not have to invest in anyone or anything anymore, and you're completely free to just, I guess, be away forever, right?
Yeah. To be self-defining. Um, and again, I get that these themes are in Western culture, particularly post-Reformation. I think about these things because of my vocation. So with Martin Luther, when I thank God for the Reformation, but the core of the Reformation for Luther appears to have been, how can I, as a person, rightly relate to God? And that's
Yeah.
not wrong, but it's intrinsically individualistic, right?
Sure.
But that has become untethered from the things you just talked about, natural law, and even, I mean, I guess the thing that really has to be brought back and put back in consideration is, how do I even know who I am?
Yeah.
So I think the dominant cultural answer is, I am my appetites, be those sexual, be those career aspirations, even things that are intrinsically supposed to, by God's design, draw you out of that self-centered way of thinking, like marriage and kids, are now thought of in those categories. Like, do I want to be married? How many kids do I want to have? Um, and they become lifestyle accessories to the autonomous of individual who's just choosing, like a choose your own adventure book. That's kind of a showing my age there, or an open world video game. We're all kind of living Grand Theft Auto and deciding, will my life be main narrative? Maybe I'll get to there, but I can spend a lot of time on these side quests that will make me feel fulfilled, or make my appetites. They'll cater to my appetites, and that can be just great. And man, it just causes so much chaos. I remember when I was younger, I was doing student ministry, and it was a fairly younger church I was at. But we were full of these people who had decided that, like, well, children will be for my 40s.
Yeah.
And
That was the default.
yeah, and I remember being in just tons of prayer meetings with these women who were just bawling. I can't remember all I've talked about with you before, but they were just bawling because the fertility treatment didn't take this month, or they had to go do something more invasive to try to get pregnant and whatnot. And I remember thinking, like, I didn't have it all sorted out, but I thought, how did we get here?
Yeah.
Having babies is trouble, And I came to realize it's because you were told, get your degree, get a few years on your career, get some travel in once you start making some money, and then kids can come later. But biology is still the same,
Yeah.
and your reproductive years are still when your reproductive years are. And the promises of technology, sophisticated as they are, still aren't delivering. And so these people are just living in agony and chaos because what they eventually settled on, that I think is more consistent with God's design, they jumped in way late. And there's some choices you make, you just can't wind the clock back on.
Yeah.
So
That,
it just brings a lot of human carnage.
yeah, man. And that's a tough one to hear about. Like, that is,
Yeah.
I mean, when I make a bad choice, I am responsible for that choice. But at the same time, it's like, man, you guys were lied to
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
about what would be fulfilling.
Yeah. Well, and John, I should confess, that was me, man. I mean, I grew up in an environment that I'm now so incredibly thankful for, and I've returned to, self-consciously tried to re-enmesh myself with. But I honestly, it was so arrogant. Came from a wonderful family, and I thought, these farmers and these hillbillies, they've really set me up well, and now I can move our family forward and
Yeah,
move into academia or whatever, and more elite circles. And at some point, thankfully, God was like, "Dummy, you know, the way forward is back." Again, to Lewis, right? The guy who's actually making progress is the one who turns around from a bad path first.
yep,
And so, when I say these things, it's not like they're external to me. I live that path.
yeah. You need to
I live that too.
100%. Yeah, I mean, we're going to be both products of our generation and the lies, of whatever was kind of the main thing of our generation, for
Yeah.
sure. We're going to buy into some degree or other. And I think a theme is definitely emerging for those who watch this. We're getting to it, and that is, we're going to talk about the fact that we are, local people, and the answer in our lives in terms of political life and social life. Obviously, it starts with the Lord, and part of that is the Lord has made us local people. It's interesting, kind of, to take one little side quest, as you called it, just in thinking about just these types of things. Not all cultures' sins are the same.
Mhm.
Some nations or cultures or wherever are going to have sin patterns that dominate them that I would never dream of or encounter.
Sure.
So it's interesting when you come into contact with another culture, you're exposed to a some of the lies of maybe another culture, but also some of the lies of your own. And we know that the evil one, Satan, is the father of lies. So I was recently in a public just place out and about in town with a couple of people from, I'll just say, a different culture. And we were talking, and I was struck by, it was a man and a woman, they were married. And she said, like, well, he's going to make this decision because, well, he's the leader. He's such a smart guy. And I was like, I don't know if I've ever heard that, hardly ever in the history of my life living in Western culture, and even all that explicitly in the church. And yet, even to unbelievers who are not from a Christian background, they sense and know that that's a
Yeah.
natural good knit into the fabric reality by God. And that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about in this conversation. What is normal according to God's design? But I just found that so striking that it was so obvious to her. Like, of course, he's a leader. He's my head.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's encouraging. It's refreshing. Like I feel like we're living in a time of renewal. There are people who are realizing sort of the same things we're talking about, and on their version of the same kind of trajectory to try to return to some of these things. But I feel like a lady in the West would feel hesitant, even if she was deeply convicted of those things. She would feel hesitant to kind of pop that out in casual conversation because
Yeah.
will this person I'm talking to receive that well? That does seem very foreign, which is mind blowing.
Yeah. It seems like to me the default reaction that men are taught to have in our culture to women are one of two things, either A, worship, or B, object.
Hmm.
I feel like the dominant thing that women are taught to think about men in our culture is eye roll.
Hmm.
Like when
Hmm.
I think of modern marriage in the West, I think of if there's anything, good happening in it, like if it's a man and a woman, I think the man usually is her stepping stool or he worships her, and he's an eye roll to her. He's no
Yeah.
leader. He's just someone to he yeah, he's just the guy that has a different anatomical part of basically the
And
shape.
every institution in our culture is reinforcing that narrative,
Yeah.
right? I mean, where do you find? I mean, it's evangelicalism's eat up with it, and so like if the church can't see through it, the government's going to no way, or higher education, anything like that. So I completely agree, and I think again, the chaos of our age is showing us the fruits of that. I don't know. You may trace that back to maybe the '60s. I feel like we're still in the ongoing sexual revolution. We're just late stage.
Yeah.
Um, but we've got plenty of returns on this at that point. And I'm not saying that men are kind of guaranteed a great return. Who doesn't know a guy who doesn't know a guy who's abused his power or made terrible decisions or taken advantage of a woman who really did want to be led well? Of course, those things are true. But writ large, as a cultural narrative that is like forming again that vision of the good life, we can tell now it kills kids, it kills marriages, it kills homes, it dehumanizes, it mutilates people. It's not done better. If you want to say we've moved in a different direction, I think we have. Clearly, it's not working better than patriarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll transition into this localism, or just being someone who knows that you've been put in a particular place for however long it is. God has put you here, and while you're in your place, you are to invest in that place. And you come from a particular culture and all these sorts of things. These are realities that are good things, that are normal and natural. So what are some things, Jeff, that you might have seen that would help Christians return to a mindset of just being a city or a citizen in the area where they live and investing? Could be a church ministry, could be just Christians in a social setting, could be a school, a sport. Just have you seen practical examples maybe the last couple of years that you're like, oh, like they're doing something that is helpful to them and also helpful to the people in which they live among and are a part of?
Yeah, thankfully I can say that I've seen that. And one of the things I want to say is that when you kind of talked to me about coming back on, you said let's talk about localism, and politics was kind of in the pitch there. But I'll just commend you for remembering that localism is where it's at.
Yep.
And so you already mentioned it. It's by God's design that proximity matters. So I commend you for seeing that, and seeing as an antidote to some of the cultural chaos we're living in here. So years ago, my wife and I both came from families that we're very thankful for. And I want to say this as respectfully as possible to our parents. Good Christian, at least cultural Christian families, right, who had a high view of Jesus, at least in terms of rhetoric, and in some notable examples, very real faith. But we didn't feel like we had real good models for how do you disciple your children from day one. So we got married, started trying to find counselors on that, read a lot of good books, and I think it was Rachel Jankovich I think she's the author of a book called Keeping the Little in Your Girl. Like,
Hmm.
the idea being that we don't want to rush past the goodness of young girls into uh, an adult vision of womanhood that's defined by a culture that really seems to push them in that direction really fast. Again, going back to your idea that one of the dominant views of women is objectify.
Yeah.
And in that book, I remember my wife bringing me the book and saying, listen to this. And I think it was Rachel. She said, when you think of yourself, and this, I mentioned this earlier in kind of the stream of Western culture, starting with Luther, who is the individual that I am? And in this book, she said, there's no version of you that is not defined by your most important relationships.
Yeah.
So if I'm remembering it correctly, the example she used, which I run into all the time, everybody listening to this has to, a married couple, one of the spouses meets somebody else, and the narrative is, well, I want to be happy, and I feel like this person helps me be my best self, or whatever. And the question that author raised was, well, how do you know who you are? And what she said in light of God's covenant is, there is no you who is not defined by your covenant marriage
Hmm.
to this person that you're considering leaving.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about you, there's never a you that is not um, understood by God to be defined by that covenant you made with Him and that spouse. So whatever you is going to run off with this into this adulterous relationship. Um, that's going to go with you. And so, and again, all the caveats, right? The Bible has certain criteria that says a divorce is appropriate, right? So,
Yeah, of course.
all those caveats. But running off with the secretary or the guy at work isn't one of those caveats. So you remain who you are in that covenant relationship, even if you're being unfaithful to it. And I actually think that's a really strong model to take into the broader realm. I mean, God's organized His world under subordinate authorities,
Mhm.
subordinate governance, so the governance of the family, the church, and then the civic arena. And in all three of those, when you're thinking about yourself, the question has to be, how do these relationships define who I am? And any kind of model or theory or aspiration I have that's pushing me to define myself contrary to those relationships, I think the default setting should be, that's a lie.
Not
That
good. Yeah.
that's taking me in an unhealthy direction.
Yeah.
And so, just to get to your question, that's where I would encourage people to think through these things afresh with their family, right? And a conscious vision of being married and having children. Clearly, fertility in the Bible is always the sign of God's blessing. Barrenness is always the sign of God's cursing. Again, all the caveats. There's medical conditions that get in the way and disrupt the normative pattern, but this is the normative pattern.
Yep.
The local church. These are the Christians that I'm most responsible for, and who are most responsible for me. And then the neighbors that you live in proximity to. I think, not to go on too long, but
Yeah, no,
we
you're fine.
started
Yeah,
before we hit record. It's a national presidential election. You can't help but be told and feel the weight of significance there. Um, and those things are important. But in the wisdom of the way you want to talk about this, it's actually not as important as what's happening locally. You can get obsessed with, can we get my candidate elected? Are there just national voting laws and regulations that'll make sure we have fair elections? Those are very important
yeah,
questions,
100%.
but they're not nearly as important as what's happening, within the driving distance of your local city. And so again, I would just, to your point, coming back to localism and constantly sort of building that in as a self accountability measure. Okay, what are the relationships I'm in, and how am I being faithful or unfaithful in them? How am I giving the bulk of my best energy to those things? And I think that's the paradigm that we want to be living in, helping others live in, asking others to reinforce in us in those areas of family and church and governance.
Yeah, yeah, amen. And I mean, the church too. We have, I mean, universal church, but a local church that wants to honor God in all areas of life has such an opportunity. Believers in an area have such an opportunity, for lack of a better term, to do things
Mm-hmm.
that are great for God's kingdom and are mighty works for God. I mean, and it doesn't. Again, it doesn't have to be you're saving kids from being aborted or something. That's great, but like starting a business. Like I've seen some friends
Mm-hmm.
recently. One was in a tougher position. One was really savvy with certain things, and a couple more are just really helpful. And now they're running something that's like it's off the ground and it's going. And
Yeah.
that's just kind of, and now they're, you know, Lord willing, will be more and more of a presence in a small way, but growing in this little local town, that we're in. And I think what they do, it's noble work and it's a blessing. There's just like one example that comes to mind, but in my experience and in my temptation, it's just go to church, silo off, and
Mm-hmm.
not thinking strategically about the area we live in. You know, we're more
Yeah.
invested. I'm more invested. It can be very easy to be more invested in like some random TikToker
Mm-hmm.
in China or something. Well, maybe not,
Mm-hmm.
but like some other country where it's like you could legitimately be the average person in our society and care more about that than ever
Yes.
knowing your local culture and being about that. And there's kind of that's a scary thing to think about, is how quick that's lost. And it's like how much strangers we are to each other, like next door
Well,
neighbors, these types of things.
right. And you asked for examples. If you start thinking about local examples, um, I have an obligation to brothers and sisters across the world. If Armenia, or think about some stuff that's happened to African believers in recent years, I do have an obligation there, and I want to care and help there.
Yeah.
But I can have so much less impact just because of the dilution of resources reaching across those literal miles than I can locally. So you talked about uh, children dying. I mean, you live within driving distance of an abortion clinic. Maybe not as many as there used to be, but where can you have the biggest impact on abortion? It's not in DC. They don't know you. They don't care about you. The National Right to Life groups, I've become convinced, are grift organizations. They're
Yeah.
a fundraising number for them,
Yeah.
but you can actually make a dent locally, and you can meet people who can consolidate with you to make a dent. And once you start scratching that fascination with those who are out there, you start to see how it really just wastes our resources to become obsessed in that way. Again, I'm a Southern Baptist hanging on by the skin of my teeth, but because it was a mechanism to have an impact beyond the local that I wouldn't otherwise have a footprint in. But nonetheless, that is so less important. So to give local examples that are encouraging, um, my family and I helped start a Christian school in our area about 12 years ago. God has blessed it tremendously, and He's given us a faculty who have a vision for the impact it can bring, yes, to the kingdom broadly, but the area we live in. I was actually teaching there full time when the church I pastor called me, and I told the administration and I told the local church the only thing I would leave this school for is a local church, because I think it's the only institution that can better have an impact on this area than this school can. And so we've got people really sacrificially laboring in that arena, and it's super encouraging. It's easier to be self-sacrificial yourself when you're working with co-laborers who do it too.
100%.
So there's a force multiplier there. When I took the church pastorate that I'm in, I knew I wanted to pastor in this area, and I was just going to wait for a church, if in God's providence, that they would call me. But I remember talking to a guy with campus outreach and what I wanted to see in the church and what I was hoping God would do. And he said, "Yeah, man, just go pick out a tombstone. Go buy your cemetery plot. Yeah, put up a headstone, and know this is where they're going to plant you, and you're staying here until you get to that planting. That kind of planting."
Yeah.
And it was great advice, and I'm thankful he gave it to me. And then I'm in a circle now of guys like myself who have family farming legacies, and once thought that wasn't part of our future, wasn't part of my family future beyond the previous generation. But I now know a considerable number of guys who are like, what I'd like to do is not just continue this legacy and the good it brought to my family. There's something about farming as a vocation and that's good for humans, but also in turbulent times, it is nice to say not only I have some access to food supply, but I have something to share with my neighbors. I can be hospitable. We can have a productive household that we can be generous with, and we can share. And not everybody has those options in the same way. But those are three things that I've seen in probably the last 6 years that really do indicate a return and a renewal. My friend Dusty Devers, faithful pastor, I love Dusty. Dusty decided to run for his state legislature, and in God's providence, he was elected. And so this is a guy who, Dusty is as gifted a human being as I know. Could do anything, and has a resume that indicates that he could do anything. But he decided, I'm going to serve the church. I think I have some giftedness for the public sphere, and so I'm going to go into that. And he's serving locally. If I could flip a switch, I'd give Dusty the controls, for all of society. But he knows where he can make his biggest dent, and he's doing it. And so those things are really encouraging. I don't know that I'll live in the full. If God blesses those things in the way I hope, I don't know that I'll get to see that. But my children, my grandchildren, my great grandchildren, they may get to.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's a factor here too. Like, you've got to think of yourself as somebody's great grandfather, and somebody's great grandmother. And what are they going to wish you had done? If if they got their head screwed on right, what are they going to wish you had done?
Yes.
That's a pretty good thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's fair to say we're still putting the pieces together, but I think the Lord is waking Christians up in many ways. I guess to a lot of things, to the need to be a part of a local church, to the idea that, oh yeah, there is this thing called biblical Christianity, and it's not just me and Jesus in a field, all these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Lord is, he's waking a lot of biblical Christians up, and people are coming to faith in him in the US. And I think one of those things is Christians realizing, like, oh yeah, we're not in this alone, and we can help each other. And we can help people, because even if they don't, even if they hate us, like, we can do this because Christ has called us to do that. And he said that Satan will not stand against the kingdom of God.
What's the fail-safe that God built into the Christian life for when everything's gone sideways? It's church discipline. There's this third stage of being told you can't come to the Lord's table. We're no longer identifying you as a Christian. That's supposed to go off like a nuclear bomb in a person's life and say, I have to reevaluate what I'm doing, right? that has no weight beyond what God might be pleased to supernaturally assign to it if there aren't deep, meaningful relationships that have been cultivated over years.
Yeah.
If I'm isolated from the people that I attend church with, even if a lot of churches don't practice church discipline,
Yeah.
but the mechanism God built in as an objective check on sin in our life is your church coming to you and saying you're in crisis and we're not going to let it go unchecked. And it all falls apart if I've lived as an autonomous individual with no roots. I don't care about, I've been to this church. I'll go to that church if they make me mad,
Yeah.
or I'll move cities and start all over again because one worship experience is as good as the other, or I'll find one that's
Yep.
comparably close. If
And
you don't have the weight,
that's the term right there, worship experience.
yeah, exactly. If you don't have the weight of the personal relationships, I don't want to say bolstering, because I think so much of the worship experience stuff is superficial and actually a barrier to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But if
No,
you don't have
absolutely. Lights
significant
are down, you're
relationships
a
with
silo.
Christians, yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember. So our church, and again, these like my predecessor was great. I'm thankful for him. I'm thankful for the people who were at the church when I got there. But we had one service where it was like we're dimming the lights, and I remember when I was moving the church away from those things, there was a member who said, "No, that's my time. That's my time with just me and the Lord." And I was like, "That's not what corporate worship is, man.
Yeah.
That's not it. And we're not going to keep doing things that reinforce
Yeah.
that idea." And so, if that is what your church is, you basically have no check on, "Hey, man, you're about to walk away from your family. Well, we're not letting that happen easily
Yeah.
in a way that matters to you. That you might actually go, ooh, maybe I should reconsider these choices I'm thinking about making."
Yeah. 100%. I mean, that's we could get into a whole different conversation about just what is the church and
Mhm.
ecclesiology, and where we've definitely gotten things wrong, and the American church and things like that. But I think
Mhm.
some of a huge part of the themes that we're talking about is just the Lord working in people that have been redeemed by Christ and know one another. We have to know one another in order to practice the one another's. Um, and you
And
have,
be enmeshed in each other's life, right? Like the guy who comes to me and says you're in sin, you should repent. It's going to be a different conversation if when I threw my back out and was having to have surgery, he brought food to my family,
yeah,
right? Or if he's just the equivalent of like uh, Jobs giving a Apple product reveal every Sunday. I don't care, man.
yeah,
Whatever. I have no relationship to you. And so you've got to build those things before the crisis comes, and you've got to help build those with other people before their crisis comes.
and that is just as a Christian what you said there. That I appreciate that. That's so convicting in terms of. I mean, you talked about Luther earlier. He helped remind the church there's a priesthood of all believers, and that no one soul. Also, a part of that is no one soul is greater than another. We are all
Sure.
sinners who have been given bread by Christ,
Hmm.
and like even Paul, thinking with that thought, was a tremendous evangelist, a tremendous preacher, and yet, I think some of those New Testament books are very clear in terms of his life and labor of love just with the people that he
Yeah.
called his. A little different with him. He's an apostle, so he has multiple things going on, but like these were people that knew him and he knew them, and they got dirty, if you will, together.
Absolutely. And he took
It's
the time, even as a guy who knew he would be traveling to plant. I mean, you read his all the language he uses with the church is familial. You
100%.
know, I, um, I, I betrothed you to one husband. It's a dad giving a daughter off in marriage. I mean, like, and he was, he could legitimately say to a church, "You know how I lived with you. You know how I sacrificed to care for you. You know I wasn't a burden to you." Even with him as a model of like the guy who knows he's going to be moving on at some point, he did it in such a way that everybody who like knew him was like, "No, he's deeply invested in us, and he cares deeply." And he he capitalizes on those things when he has to send a letter to the Corinthian church, the Galatian church,
I'm
and
not just some guy.
yep.
I'm a part of you. And so therefore, when I send a rebuke, when I send
Mhm.
correction, it's going to mean it's not a hypocritical source.
Yeah, and thinking about church discipline with the Corinthian church, you can legitimately say, I'm an apostle. I'm using that. I'm pulling that card, but relationally too, I'm going to encourage your body when you're together to do these things with the sinning brother, so that he might be saved from his sin. And so, it's just built into Paul's paradigm, his understanding of the church, that these relationships matter for himself as an apostle and planner. But then also he's leaning on the people who are there every day and saying, this is on your shoulders. You have to act appropriately here if this person's going to honor Christ the way that we all want to see happen. And if your church is going to be healthy, if your church is going to be spiritually healthy, you're going to have to do this too by expelling the immoral brother for a season,
Yeah,
with an eye towards repentance. Yeah.
100%. So everything by God's design, I think it's fair to say, I mean, for the most part, everything the way that Lord has designed it is, if you will, bottom up, meaning
Hmm.
everything that we can control crumbles if the foundation is not built up. So,
Well said.
if I want to have this awesome family vacation, but have not been cultivating loving my kids for 5 years, that family vacation, the big thing it's gonna blow up. It's gonna be worse
Hmm.
than National Lampoon's Vacation. And so we're talking about local kind of a stuff. I think there's a principle in there. We're talking about that's the way that God has designed just the world to work. You crawl before you walk before you run. And, if things are going to be fixed nationally, things also need to be built up in local ways. And so we're just hoping to not forget that and maybe reinvest in those areas. Transitioning into the fun world of national life in America these days, I suppose national politics, there's so much, I suppose, to talk about. Um, a faithful Christian, I wrote this down. I think you and I would agree on it. A faithful Christian in all these confusing times who knows that I can vote, I have the ability to vote, and I'm a citizen of our society. He or she will want a government that will most fit a biblical description of what a government is. And a
Well
government,
said.
yeah, that's how I have framed thinking about politics in terms of civil engagement and voting for, I think, quite some time. It's not about, do I love this candidate, love that candidate? It might play in, but it's like, what is the government? What is a governing
Hmm.
authority? And who most closely aligns with what the Bible says that is? Because whoever's doing that will also be putting in laws prayerfully in place that are actually good, according to
Yeah.
God's standard. Um,
Yeah, I mean, John, if I could just interject just a little bit, I've been sort of tangential to this, but I've been involved in it. I helped edit a statement on Christian nationalism, which is a big scare term now, and I understand. I mean, clearly the Department of Justice wants. I think I heard Tucker Carlson
they
say this, that
associate it. Christian nationalism equals you're some white racist supremacist.
right, but when they start talking about Christian nationalism, it's just what Christians have almost always believed. They have to sort of import a racism on top of that whole cloth
Yeah,
to say, oh, but look how scary and evil it is, right? But it was that line of thinking you just walked through that I was a libertarian. I was a Ron Paul libertarian for most of my adult life.
'08 revolution, baby.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's happening. Yeah. Um, but what really switched my levers is Jesus has expectations of governance. According to him, he established governments and he has certain obligations he expects them to hold to. So, one, what does he expect from a government? And then, two, what kind of world, what kind of governance do I want the neighbors I'm called to love as myself to live in? And it was answering those two questions that made me go, oh, I want them to honor Christ. I want them to do what he expects them to do in Psalm 2. Kiss the Son. You don't want him angry at you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, without a lot of the particulars of it, I mean, I've never quite understood the huge scare tactic there, or in terms of so and so, he said he believes in Christian nationalism, and it's like, okay, well, I definitely, by virtue of being a citizen in a country, I think I have to be a nationalist in terms of just base responsibility.
Hmm.
I have to understand that God has made nation states and he's made borders. And he's
Hmm.
made me, if I were like a governor or whatever, responsible to a particular people. And as a citizen, he has not to hate other peoples, but as a responsible citizen, he has made me and put me here to see that I'm a part of something. And so I have to, if nothing else, by moral responsibility, see myself as a citizen of heaven first, but this nation in particular second, not the nation
Hmm.
below me, above me, or over across the ocean. So that never made much sense of the scare term of nationalism. I was like, oh, I thought it meant just engaging in politics 101, but okay. And then like the Christian part of it's like, okay, we can talk about specifics, but it sounds pretty good.
Sure. What's the what's the greatest moral code the world's ever known?
Yeah,
It's the one revealed by Christ. Why don't let's just go to that one?
yeah,
Like, and the returns on it, of course, because it's a fallen world, the returns aren't perfect, but
yeah.
they're really good, and they're really,
Can't
really good
legislate heart
compared
change.
to everybody
Obviously,
else's. Yeah,
you can't legislate heart change. Yeah,
sure,
and I think you would understand that. Like this
sure.
is not a replacement of preaching the gospel faithfully in the context of local church. It's not the placement of any of those things. It's just saying that our laws have to come from somewhere.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm not to disagree, but I also want to add this into the hopper in that the law does do plowing or hardening,
True.
and
Yeah.
a just law is supposed to soften us towards good things and harden us towards evil. And
Yeah.
so, people, I think everybody, even if you're not
That's a good point. Yeah.
sort of like hard right wing, you noticed that LGBTQ mania
Yeah.
went into overdrive fairly recently.
Yeah.
Well,
Because it's
look at the
socially rewarded and socially
Mm,
accepted, and it's yeah
right.
from
And
on high.
The Obergefell decision says it's good,
Yeah.
right? So, like an illustration I've used locally is you say, well, the law can't change hearts. Okay, but if you hear that I got a speeding ticket doing 80 miles an hour in front of a school when it's in session and the kids are in recess,
Yeah.
you're not going to come to that with like cold objectivity and say, oh, well, there was a law, you broke it. There's certain civic penalties for that. You're going to think, Jeff, you put kids in danger.
Yeah.
It's going to teach you something about
Yeah.
your relationships to the people who live in your neighborhood and the kids who are there.
And the penalty and the shame that you get from that will
Right.
will do something.
Right. And it's good that it does. It's
Yeah.
good for me to have to face a neighbor who's like, man, my kid goes to school there. What were you thinking? I may care that I had to write a speeding ticket or I lost my license or whatever, but that someone's like, you, that was dangerous behavior around people I love, and I'm going to hold you accountable for it. That's what the law does. It actually adds heft, and it actually says something about more morality that's important, and it teaches my heart. Oh yeah, it's not okay for me to think of myself only in terms of where do I need to be when I want to be there, but I have an obligation to these people around me. Well, man, that goes all the way up to federal law. It all does that. So why does it feel like the Olympics opening ceremonies are so bizarre? Well,
Yeah.
because we live for 50 years where everybody's telling us that kind of behavior is not just okay, but it's to be celebrated and it's noble and it's heroic. That
Yeah.
actually is telling my heart something all the time
Yeah.
from the governmental level, who God says what their law is supposed to do is restrain evil.
It's
So if they tell
terrible, and
me
we ought to restrict it.
exactly, so if you're saying
Based on what the biblical definition of government is.
absolutely, so when the government privileges actual marriage, I mean, I'm going to say heterosexual marriage, that's the only kind of marriage that exists. But when it privileges, it's telling me that is not an evil to be restrained, right? But when it tells me that I can't say, under hate speech legislation or something like that, I can't say that sodomy is not an acceptable form of marriage and it shouldn't be recognized as that. It's doing the same thing. It's saying, you know, speaking the way God speaks about that sin is evil and it should restrain. And that's going to shape me as a moral person. It's going to shape my heart. It's unavoidable. It's not ultimate. The preaching of the gospel is ultimate, but it matters.
Yep.
I don't mean to get too animated, but
No, that was good. Yeah, I
this
mean,
is
you're
a
saying,
sea change in my thinking.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, again, I think there are definite, real biblical principles that you're talking about. That there is a purpose in government, that is to reward that which is good and to punish, restrain, depending on the type, evil. Right.
And it's going to shape the people who are in that restraining or cultivating. It by God's design. Again, not ultimately, but necessarily with power,
Yeah.
real power.
And so for those who watch this, I think they're taken away from what you've been saying. We need to make speeding in school zone laws great again.
Yeah,
You go back to some of the horse and buggy days. Whew, you speed past, you lose a limb, Jeff.
yeah.
Heard some
Well,
stories.
and as a guy who knows my own driving habits, I'd probably need my heart cultivated in that area too.
That's right. Yep, 100%. Well, when we get to sort of last subject a little bit, the national, we'll just say landscape, because there's obviously a presidential election coming up, and we've got the political left, and I would argue that we'll say conservative positions, I think, are consistent with, one, what the Bible teaches about, again, what government is, and two, what God has knit into reality. Things like respecting image bearers of God, not leading to murdering children in the womb, for example, or a nation state being a thing and therefore needing to understand that a border should exist. These are just a couple examples. But with the political right, I'm not even talking about the Republican Party, the political right has become extremely, I guess, just taken over by debauchery for the most part. It's been a fast thing. It still has more overall, just by virtue of getting some things right, I would argue, more redeeming value than leftism, because I think those are ultimately almost everything to the T, for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
in opposition to the way that God has created the world.
Yeah.
But in the debauched right, that's the landscape that's kind of won out, if you will, culturally. Any advice? What is a Christian to do? I'm not saying here's how he should vote in this election, but like
Mm-hmm.
thinking broadly long term, like how would I think about this? Because it's gotten crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, hashing this out at the local level, localism being the priority, but also just trying to think through in my important relationships, how do I talk about political engagements? Here's a paradigm that I've been kind of framing up for myself, and I'd love to hear your feedback on it. I think at the national level, which again, if you take a localist approach, what you said is right. Nationalism is like how you apply localism broadly.
Yeah,
You know, I want things well for Germany, but not nearly as much as I want them as well for
yeah,
the United States of America.
yep.
So the paradigm I'm thinking through with a Republican Party that appears to be moving left, and I'll
Yeah.
tell anybody watching this, Amber Rose at the RNC freaked me out. I think that's
Oh
awful.
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Um, the thing that distressed me the most was that Harmeet opened the RNC praying to a demon, you know,
Yes.
and you scan the crowd, and there's a bunch of people there who aren't Indian in terms of what you would assume their ethnic origins would be,
Yeah.
and they're praying right along. And I just think nobody threw their body in front of this. What are we doing?
Yeah.
So there's a part of me that kind of is freaked out by the American right, even as I'm encouraged that I see signs of people being like, no, we actually need to return to the natural law and conserve something that looks like
Yeah.
the natural law God revealed.
Yeah.
But the paradigm I'm thinking through is categories of brothers, friends, co-belligerents, and enemies.
Okay.
And that's a spectrum that's going to shape what I'm thinking about doing. And so if I can put meat on that, I already mentioned Dusty Devers. He's probably a singular example of this. But Dusty's a brother. I have the same confession of faith in Christ with him. I know him personally. If Dusty comes and says, Jeff, there's this political thing I'm doing, you're opposed to it, here's my conclusions, I'm just going to listen to him with great gravity, right? He's a brother. I don't think we have a lot of brothers in the national parties.
True.
There's some there, but very few.
Yeah.
And this is where maybe, I don't know who all will listen to this, but this may become offensive. I don't think there's any of them self-identifying on the left. So when I think about the categories, I have no brothers on the political left. I do still have some on the political right. I have more friends, people who we may not see eye to eye with, but who I can work with. J.D. Vance is an example. She's a Roman Catholic. I wouldn't call him a brother. I'm rooting for Tolkien. I'm rooting for Chesterton, but I'm a Protestant. I'm a Reformed Baptist. I have real problems with the Roman Catholic Church, but I would call him a friend politically.
Gotcha.
And then on the right, I do still have a considerable number of co-belligerents that I can work with on some really important issues. Not all issues, but some really important ones. So Vivek is an example of this for me. I got some heat in my circles where, I was trying to do it in fraternal fashion, but I was saying, you guys are all about Christian nationalism, but you want to vote for the demon worshiper until we get the Christian prince. Like, what are you talking about? That guy, you become like what you worship. There's no way I'm voting for a guy who worships demons. But Vivek is a co-belligerent. There's a lot of things that I can work with him on that are very important. And so those three categories, brother, friend, co-belligerent, are present, and they're going to govern who I'm working with. And I think in the political left, if you're self-identifying with the political left, you're my enemy. And I define an enemy as someone who hates Christ and hates the way of life that comes from following him. And, people, even in my local circles, kind of freak out when I draw that line. But I don't know how to speak about it with integrity without saying it. Like, this is who they say they are. I'm going to respect them enough to believe them. And, I've said this on Twitter and gotten quite a bit of pushback too, but even loving my enemies requires me to identify someone as an enemy. I have to know who my enemy is to love them. So when I'm thinking about political action, local up to national, I'm looking for brothers, I'm looking for friends, and I'm looking for co-belligerents. I don't think we have a lot of brothers in the politically organized right. I think we have a few more friends than brothers. And I think we still have a sizable number of co-belligerents. Yeah. And so that's the paradigm I'm thinking through on these matters. Yeah. I can go further with that if you want, but trying to keep it high.
Yeah. And I mean, you did say too, one, those are some interesting categories to think through for sure. Or at least one foundation of having those categories is the base point of realizing that people are coming at things with different motives and different end goals.
Yeah, right.
Like the co-belligerents, you have some things in common that it's like, well, I'm glad that you think that we should not do this, this, and this in these communities. But the reason why is probably different, and your vision of what a community should be is probably different. But, for now, it's like, at least we get these few things like together, kind of a thing.
Yeah. I mean, I learned this in the Southern Baptist Convention, actually, for years before critical race theory kind of became dominant in our institutions. We were having fights over Calvinism. And I've ended up with a bunch of brothers who are willing to fight wokeness, who I used to argue like crazy with about Calvinism.
Yeah.
Well, the things I've told them is I would so much rather have the fight over Calvinism with you. If we can kill off wokeness, let's go back to the preferable fight. Calvinism versus, I don't want to ascribe labels to people who they wouldn't embrace, either Arminianism or non-Calvinism, whichever one you feel comfortable identifying as a non-Calvinist. That's a Christian debate.
Yeah.
When you're when you're arguing with critical race theory, you're arguing with a counter religion, a counterfeit religion.
100%.
So let's work together to kill the false religion.
Yeah.
And then we'll go back to having the fraternal argument, right? And if you think about this in national politics, I would be happy to co-belligerent with Vivek to end child mutilation, in transgenderism, in the murder of children, in abortion, and then I would love to get to the fight about whose God is God.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about getting to that stage because I already know the answer. I know I'm playing on home turf, right?
Yeah.
So I just it's on triage carries some negative connotations in political and spiritual arenas, but I do think there's a triage angle that we should be considering. What's the crisis fight, and what's the fight you wish you were having? And let's try
Yeah.
to at least get to the fight you wish you were having.
Yeah. There's some good points in there. And you did mention too, kind of at the beginning of what do we do? What do we do? How do we think? Start local. Again, goes
Yeah.
back to the base of our conversation is, we have to be living by the right principles and fighting for the right things in our scope, in our family, in our
Hmm.
own life before God, then in our family, in our church, and it just expands from there in our, duty as a citizen in our local area or whatever. And then, for example, I think over time, it's like, okay, from what I know of him, which is not too much, but for example, like a Dusty Devers in Oklahoma seems to be a good example of a Christian who is a civil servant,
Hmm.
he's not a civil servant that uses the name of Christ to get his will, like his own will, done, but he seems to actually be a regenerate man who,
Hmm.
loves his family, is
Yeah,
dedicated.
I'm glad to co-sign that summary. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's like because he has built things up by the Lord's strength naturally, ground up, he is able to have more influence in a smaller way and kind of put his arms around more and more people to the point where maybe one day he'll have more influence than if he wants that. You know what I mean? Like than
Hmm.
just his state.
Or if
And
the
that's
Lord gives
just,
it to
there
him,
are
and that's
more people like him.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's another thing. As we're thinking about what do we do, it really is only the president, maybe a Supreme Court justice, but at the national level, it's only the president and Supreme Court justices who are who are national election issues.
Mhm.
I don't really have any kind of
Yeah.
relationship or have any possibility of relationship to, say, Donald Trump. Now, there are people out there who can, but or Biden or whoever. They're too far removed. But even your local congressman is running a local election.
Yeah.
He has to convince people who live near you to send him to Washington on your behalf, senator or representative.
Yeah.
Man, act like it. Act like this is a guy who's going to have to see you at the grocery store or the rally or the local political party. He's going to have to run into you because that's actually the proximity he's going to have to draw on to get sent back to the national level. Man, act like it. Make yourself known to him, and that you're going to act like he actually is accountable to you. And it may happen at his favorite restaurant if that's where you happen to cross paths. I'm not saying cause a scene or flip a table or anything, but hey, man, why weren't you there for that vote? We
Yeah.
voted you in to be there to vote, and I'm not. I don't care that you were just out here to have a nice dinner. We ran into each other. I want some answers. I
Yeah.
think that would probably renew a lot of accountability at the national level.
100%. Yeah, and that is the name of the game that has been gone for a long time.
Yeah.
Accountability. I did talk with someone recently, and because it's so easy to be like, "Oh, these terrible politicians, state
Mhm.
politicians, national." We were speaking, and I think both of us came to the conclusion like we have the politicians to some degree that we deserve as a people. And I'm a part of that to some degree, large or small, in my life. Like
Yeah.
talking about localism or lack thereof in the history of my life. Like if my state representatives, even local, are not that great, well, I've not been a great reason for them to be great because
Sure.
not invested or
Right.
I've just been thinking about this or that and the other. And so we're very, debauchery type of people. We're very selfish people, and it's like, well, who have we had running the country for a while? Like kind of us, but just with more power. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
just us, but if we had the means, in our sin, we'd be doing the same thing. So I think part of it is too just us looking in the mirror and being like, you know what? I've been taking this stuff all that seriously, but the Lord has woken me up here,
Yeah.
and I need
And
to
maybe
repent
I've
where
been
I
too
need to.
passive. Yeah, we may have been too passive.
100%.
I, I feel a burden to qualify. Maybe I shouldn't. The left has gotten rapid gains by doing a version of what I talked about, with like running into the guy at the restaurant. I'm not saying terrorize anybody. I'm not saying show
Yeah.
up at their house
Yeah.
and
Yep.
uh, put their family in a state of fear. But
Yep.
the fact the left does an extreme evil version of this should by no means make us hesitant to do an appropriate neighborly version of it and
100%.
say, no, it's appropriate for me to talk to my neighbor who, in some ways, I'm in partnership with. And because of that partnership, he has some accountability to me, or she has some accountability to me.
Yeah.
That there is an appropriate way to make a guy locally feel like, well, it'll be kind of rough back home if I'm
Yeah.
I'm not on the record for an important vote that's important to my constituents. I better, even if I'm not brave enough, I better kind of from a sense of, I don't want it to be awkward at the grocery store, be there. And then also, I don't know if this is true or not, but observationally, it looks like Ron DeSantis had a magnet effect. So you said you're a sports fan.
Yeah.
Before the NBA went super woke, I was the biggest NBA fan that I knew, and I've watched the NBA for a long time. It's clear that Michael Jordan's the greatest player ever.
Thank you.
Yeah,
We get
I
into
love.
postmodernism and
Oh
sports
yeah,
debates, but it's like even not on a tangent too much, but it's like even debates within sports, we're so non-logical where it's like we're
yeah,
having these debates that like someone has said, quote unquote, Paul George is the GOAT. Like, and it's like that's because we're radically subjective. Anyway,
yeah.
audience,
Right.
this is
Recency
tangential.
bias unchecked. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, man. We saw Scottie Pippen play. We actually know a better Paul George.
Yeah.
But so I love Larry Bird. But I will tell you that I think Steph Curry is the greatest shooter of all time. And one of the ways you can see that is the Steph Curry magnetism effect, the way that he draws a defense to himself because they're terrified he can shoot anywhere, right?
Yep.
I think Ron DeSantis has had a magnet effect on some other red state governors that's profitable, where by being bold, he kind of put wind in their sails.
100%.
I think at local levels, we can have a magnet effect. Brother, look, not only will you not lose political capital among us if you're even more bolder, you're going to find some real positives coming your way. You're going to get better fundraising. You're going to get better encouragement at the local level. Like we want to reward what we want to see more of. I think that can happen too in a magnet effect. And then, if 2 or 3 state senators or national senators realize like, well, our districts are all pretty close to each other, what's working for him may work for me. I actually think that that's a way to sort of encourage good things very broadly.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think you're right about that. When one person speaks up or is doing something, it emboldens others.
Yeah, and at bare minimum, it tells you who the true coward is, who has to be replaced.
Yeah.
If all the winds are in your sails and you're still failing, we got to get you gone. You're an anchor.
Yep. That's a good way to put that. Well, this has been, I don't know if I have too much more, man. This has been awesome. I really appreciate it. This conversation, I think we've touched on a lot of things. We've gone coast to coast in America.
Yeah.
We've gone local,
Yeah.
national. We didn't go as much international. Maybe next time.
Maybe next time. Yeah, we got more time. Hey, John, it's always a pleasure, man. I really enjoy our conversations, and I hope other people do. But I could talk to you forever, and whether or not anybody saw it. So thanks for having me on.
It is a fun time. I think next time I have you on, we got to make it. I need to make it me and you plus one. I got to get another voice in here and just have it. I need some of this. I think people will like
that. Sounds fun. Yeah, that sounds good.
You were part of Backwoods Belief, right?
Yeah. So that's a podcast that isn't as consistent, but we're kind of on a hot streak releasing episodes. Anybody who's interested, we'd love to love to have them hit download and tell us what they think about the podcast.
Yeah. Well, I will certainly let people know about that on the video underside or whatever you call it.
Okay.
But I appreciate it, man. Thanks so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Hey, same to you, and thanks again.